Okay, so let's see a few more things. You have already seen this, the core DNS pods that are launched in the Cube system namespace. And these are the pods which are providing DNS service to Kubernetes. In fact, this entire ecosystem of Kubernetes. Now, there's one more thing is that we have this service named Cube DNS, which is of type cluster IP, and the cluster IP is 10.96.0.10. So what does it mean? What it is doing? So this service or this IP address is being used by the pods to connect to this DNS system, which is core DNS. Now, if we go to each of the pods in this Kubernetes cluster, and if we check resolve.conf, hcresolve.conf, we should see this IP address, which is 10.96.0. So let's take a look. Let's try the prod namespace. We have these 7 pods. One of them is busybox. But what I'll do is I will go into one of the pods. Sorry, I should mention the namespace. And I'm inside of this pod. Now, if I take a look at hcresolve.conf, I should see this one. See, name server is 10.96.0.10, which is nothing but the cluster IP address of the Cube DNS service in Cube system namespace, and it would be there in all the other pods. Let's take one more pod. Let's say this one, and in here also the name server is 10.96.0.10, which is the cluster IP of the Cube DNS service. So whenever we enter service name without not the IP address, it will go and try to search the IP address that corresponds to that service in this name server. Now let's proceed with the demo further. You already know that we have two namespaces right now. One of them is default namespace and the other one is prod namespace. So in prod namespace we have a deployment, and behind the deployment we have actually 6 pods, not 2. And we also have created a service, and the name of the service is K8S node port service. And that service is doing a load balance across all the pods under that service. Now what I'll do is I'll launch a busybox pod in the default namespace, and then I'll try to connect it to this service, which is another namespace. Now let's do that. Now this is the command to run a busybox pod at the minimum. So I'll not use the namespace busybox. So it says that the busybox pod is already existing. So let's see. Okay, we have this busybox pod running, not this one, this one. So let's go ahead and go inside of this pod. So now I am inside of this busybox pod, and now let's try to connect to the service which is in another namespace, and that service is K8S service node port. So first what we'll do is we'll try to find the IP address of this service, and let's see if we can get 10.100.230.197 or not. So I'm inside of this busybox pod in default namespace. Let's do an NS lookup of the service, which is K8S service node port, and also mention the namespace, which is .prod .svc.cluster.local. Now one thing I want to tell you here is that you can omit svc.cluster.local also, but if I press enter, surprisingly enough I do not get the IP address. It says no answer. So to resolve this, what you have to do is you have to give the IP address of the pod where core DNS is running, which is this one. Core DNS is running in 10.32.0.2. So if I give the IP address of that pod, then it says the IP address of the service is 10.100.230.197, which is the cluster IP address and which is correct. What if we remove svc.cluster.local? Then it says it cannot find. So there's some internal reason why it is not happening. I do not want to go into the details of that, but make sure to test this. If you are testing this, make sure to give the IP address of the pod. It should have happened automatically, but as I say, there's some internal reason for which it is not working. We have to give the IP address of the pod where core DNS is running. Now let me try to access the web page in this service. So I'm using this K8S service node port prod svc.cluster.local followed by the port number, and then I'm doing cat index.html. The reason I'm using wget because curl is not available in this busybox container. So that's fine. Now if you see, I am getting the output saying that hello, I'm a container inside of a K8S pod with a background color of orange, and this is the same service that we are using. Okay, so now what I'll do is that I'll try to do the same thing the from a busybox pod in the same namespace. So I have this busybox pod in prod namespace, and I'll go inside of this busybox pod and try to connect to the service within the same namespace. All right, I'm inside of this busybox pod, and if I type the service name, now here I do not have to write the entire service name. If I just write K8S service port, service node port, then I should, oops, sorry, it should be wget. Curl is not available, so wget and the service name, and then I know that the page is index.html. If I see connecting to 10.100.230.197, which is nothing but the cluster IP of this particular service. Now it will not work because it is trying to connect to port number 80, and our service is running on port 8080. So if I type 8080, I should be able to see the same output, which is hello, I'm a container inside of a K8S pod. So 10.100.230.197 is the IP address, is the cluster IP of the service. Here you go. This is the cluster IP of the service K8S service port. And if I do an ns lookup of this service, now it is showing me the address 10.100.230.197. Let's see the resolve.conf file, which also has name server as 10.96.0.10. So for all the pods, the name server has been set as the service cluster IP of Kubernetes DNS.